Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought we'd do a video today looking at some interesting Yugoslavian vehicles. Even though Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore, that doesn't mean that it won't come to War Thunder, and since they've added the Yugoslavian flag in the most recent update, but not really added it to any vehicles, and then also, earlier in the year we got some voice lines which would correspond to that region in the world, it is only a matter of time before Yugoslavia makes its way into it, whether it is in a subtree, a independent tree, or maybe event and also premium vehicles. At the end of the day, Yugoslavia is one of those interesting areas, not just politically, but also with some of the crazy vehicles that they built. And in this video, we're going to have a look at a few of them. Let's get into it. The first vehicle is a modification of one, and it is a Samoa S35, but with an Ordnance QF6 pounder, which is just ridiculous when you see the picture of this vehicle. Basically, this was born out of a bit of necessity in 1944 to 45, and it was created by some Yugoslavian partisans. Basically, in the area that Germany controlled, they used a lot of captured vehicles to be able to police certain areas, whether it was against partisans or just keeping the population in check. They used stuff like Samoa S35 or Hotchkiss H39s to keep everybody calm and also controlled. Now, the partisans in the area of Yugoslavia decided that that wasn't going to be, and they ended up taking out a lot of these tanks, which were actually used in the area. And at the same time, the partisans didn't really get a ton of support from outside powers, but they did get a few vehicles. They got some M3A3s and also some AEC Mark II armoured cars, which were given by the British. So what they decided to do with some of these Samoas that they captured, they were going to basically put them into service with what they wanted to. A lot of them were taking out though, so there wasn't actually a ton of them. And one of the S35s, because of the fact that it was in 1944 that they captured it, they decided to upgun it because, of course, well, the firepower of it was pretty good in 1936, but not exactly great in 1944. So they upgunned it with a 6-pounder gun on the turret. They also removed the upper protective plates on the running gear, so that was open too. It looks kind of crazy for the vehicle, but at the end of the day, if it worked, it worked. The next vehicle is the Vesilo A, or the Teskey Tank Vesilo A. Now, you may look at this and think T-34-85, but there are some differences. And what I'm going to do is I'll link the post in the description of the video, and I'm going to read what Sentient Burger V2 said about it. During 1948, a special commission was formed to examine the tactical and technical characteristics for the future domestic-built tank, named Vehicle A, sometimes also called Type A. The Yugoslav designers had two dilemmas. Should they improve the characteristics of the already existing T-34-85 Soviet tanks, or design and build a brand new tank? The construction of a new tank required a developed industry and also a high number of educated and qualified personnel, and perhaps most importantly, it'd take a long time to complete the implementation and the production. Due to the bad economic situation, mostly due to the damage done to the industry and infrastructure during the war, production of a new tank wasn't realistic or possible in the near future. As a result of this, the Special Commission proposed a plan to improve the T-34-85 tank. The interior and the crew positions of Tank A were almost identical to the T-34. The driver was located on the left side, while the radio operator, who was also the machine gunner, the radio used was the British SET-19WF, with an operational range of 10 to 15 kilometers, was on the right side of the hull. In the tank turrets, there were a commander, the gun operator, and also a loader. The main armament was the Soviet 85mm Zis-53 gun, with some minor modifications done on it, such as improved hydraulics and adding a muzzle brake, although the original Soviet ammunition was still used. 50 rounds of ammunition for the main gun were carried inside Vehicle A. The original Soviet TS-15 sight device was exchanged with a German TZF-1, taken from captured Panzerkampfwagen 4 tanks, with an improved modification of ×4 instead of 3. The maximum elevation of the gun was -10 to +17. The secondary weapons were also changed. The Soviet DTM 7.62mm machine guns were abandoned, and instead 2 MG42s were installed, one in the hull and one in the turret. A third heavy machine gun was installed on the roof of the turret to be used for light and also anti-aircraft roles. The frontal armor thickness was 50mm at an angle of 30, while the angled front hull corners, side and the rear armor was 45mm thick. The whole roof and floor armor was similar, 20 to 25mm. The turret was elliptical shaped with frontal thickness of around 100mm, with the side 82 to 86mm and the rear 60mm. The tank turret was narrower but higher than the original T-34 one. The next vehicle is of course the SO-122, because it's very hard to talk about Yugoslavia without of course talking about this machine. It's a perfect example of what a lot of Yugoslavia was, a massive mixture of Eastern ideas and also Western ideas put together. Yugoslavia got a bunch of vehicles from the West, namely a bunch of Shermans and also Hellcats, and they decided to build a prototype of their own to try and push forward and keep these Shermans useful going forward into the battlefield so they didn't just deteriorate and would become inferior to the vehicles that they were facing. So the SO-122 idea was born, the idea of a Sherman which had access to a 122mm gun. Now, this project, there isn't a ton known about it when it comes to specific ideas, because there is a lot of secrecy around it, but basically, you take a Sherman, you add a modified T-34 engine to it, you had the V2 engine, and then also the V2R engine, which was the modified one, and then you build a 122mm for the gun. Basically, they were going to go forward with a 100mm project, but that was rejected because it would be a bit too expensive. So the 122mm idea, a domestic 122, was the idea pushed forward. They were going to use parts of a T-54 gun, specifically the hydroelectric system and the breech lock, and then create, of course, a muzzle brake for the big gun as well. So just imagine a Sherman with a upgraded T-34 engine with a 122mm, and that is the SO-122. It is also very hard to talk about Yugoslavia without, of course, mentioning the M84. The M84 is a MBT specifically based off the T-72M, which was the export variant of the T-62A. We actually have a bunch of T-72M1s in the game, which is basically just the M but upgraded to the T-72A standard. What the Yugoslavians decided to do was to actually change it to improve it in their own domestic sense. So they added a domestic fire control system to it, they also improved the composite armor that was on the vehicle, and as well added a 1000 horsepower engine to it. Now there are a bunch of different variants of the M84, and obviously it was through the Yugoslav wars that this vehicle was used and then also came afterwards, and depending on which country you look at, there is a bunch of different variants of it, even going to the M84D, which is from Croatia. Depending on what you want to see, there are a ton of modernized variants and all based off the basic T-72, but even still in service today. The 125mm 2A46 stays around though, and of course it has all of the other stuff that makes it a T-72, but with a bit of Yugoslavian flair. We've also got to talk about the aviation side of things, starting off with the Soco J21 Yastreb, or the Jastreb. This vehicle was a light attack aircraft, and just like a lot of other light attack aircrafts, it was actually developed from a trainer vehicle, giving it a little bit more oomph when it came to the general ground pound nature. At the time, the Yugoslavians used the F-84 Thunderjet, but they wanted to replace it since, of course, the Thunderjet was becoming a little bit old compared to what it could generally fight. They tried a bunch of different things, and they settled on the idea of the J21, and overall, it was actually quite successful for them. They made over 200 of them, it was produced between the 60s and 70s, and eventually actually got retired in 2006 for its respective country. The vehicle itself had access to the BMB, or the Rolls-Royce Bristol Siddeley Viper Mark 531 good old engine. This meant that it had a maximum speed of 820 kilometers an hour, and obviously being one of these light attack vehicles, it did have 8 hardpoints on it, which could carry stuff like bombs. It could also carry incendiary ammunition, or incendiary bombs I should say. It also could carry rockets and all of that good stuff. It was also armed with 3 12.7mm Browning A&M 3 machine guns, which seems odd since usually we have even numbers of these things. So this would be a really nice kind of starter jet, or a jet which could fill the ground attack role for the ground forces. With 1948 being an inventive year for the Yugoslavians, basically because of the Tito-Stalin split, it meant that a lot of technologies came out of it. We already talked about one of them in the form of the Vesilo A. Now it's time to have a look at another one, the S49, or the Icarus S49. This vehicle took, once again, Western technology and Eastern technology and stuck them together. And you may think that it's actually based off of something like a Yak 3 or a Yak 9 based on what it looks like, but it was actually based off the Rogozarski IK3, which was a 1930s Yugoslav monoplane, which looks very similar to some of the early French aircraft that you see in the tech tree. There was a bunch of different variants of this thing because they built it with a bunch of different engines and a bunch of different parts, since the VK-105 engines from the Soviets were not available anymore, and they were the ones which we used previously. They used the Klimov M105 engine for the S49A, and for the C, they actually used the Hispano Suiza 127 engine. The other thing that's also interesting is this vehicle had one 20mm MG151, it had two 12.7mm Browning M2s, so Germany and America as offensive armaments when it comes to guns. It could also carry HVARs and also 50 kilo bombs. This vehicle, powered by the Hispano Suiza, so the C variant, was able to get to a maximum speed of 628 kilometers an hour, and would generally feel pretty nice to fly in the game. It's also one of those vehicles that was heavily built. They built 150 of them during the 50s, and it was retired in the 1960s. This gives you kind of a taste of what Yugoslavia could bring to the game, and as many have talked about, it isn't really a nation then that fits fully anywhere, so we'll have to see how they decide to add it in. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Brendan Quinn, Vilneus, Character Fuel, Juan the Panda, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie, B. Young, Bareen, Peter Grayling, Alan Hacker, Sem Alslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R., and also Lafouche for supporting the channel.